He built a criminal empire with his bare hands, only to lose the lower half of his body to a car bomb. Bitter, isolated, and entirely paralyzed from the waist down, he fired every professional nurse who crossed his threshold. Then came a girl who couldn't even keep her own life together. She was loud, chronically late, and dropped his expensive scotch. But she was the only one who looked at him and didn't see a cripple. She saw a man. Sadie's 1998 Honda Civic sputtered and died exactly 3 feet before the sprawling wrought-iron gates. She slammed her forehead against the steering wheel. The horn let out a pathetic, dying honk. "Perfect," she muttered. She grabbed her oversized tote bag, currently housing 3 crumpled eviction notices, a half-eaten bagel, and her vaguely legitimate nursing certificate, and kicked her car door open. The humidity hit her instantly. So did the stare of the 2 men standing on the other side of the gate. They wore tailored suits that cost more than her entire college debt. They also wore shoulder holsters, bulky ones. "I'm here for the interview," Sadie called out, hiking her bag higher on her shoulder. "The caregiver gig. Unless you guys are the caregivers, in which case, I'll just walk into traffic now." The man on the left didn't smile. He unclipped a radio from his belt, murmured something, and the heavy gates clicked open. Sadie walked up the mile-long driveway. The estate was a fortress disguised as a mansion. High stone walls, cameras, swiveling with quiet, motorized hums, and thick oak doors that looked like they belonged on a medieval cathedral. She was patted down in the foyer by a guy named Frankie, whose nose had been broken at least 3 times. He confiscated her pepper spray, her keyring, and a rogue bobby pin. "Down the hall, last door. Don't touch anything," Frankie grunted. The house felt like a museum. Cold, dark, and utterly devoid of life. It smelled of lemon polish and stale cigar smoke. Sadie's boots squeaked against the polished marble floor. She reached the heavy double doors at the end of the hall. She didn't knock. She was 20 minutes late. Her scrubs had a coffee stain on the collar, and she figured she was already disqualified anyway. She pushed the handle and walked in. The room was vast, dominated by a massive mahogany desk, but the man wasn't behind it. He was by the window. Desmond Gallagher sat in a state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair. He was staring out at the manicured lawns. Even seated, he was an imposing figure. Broad shoulders stretched the fabric of a dark, unbuttoned dress shirt. His jawline was sharp, covered in a shadow of stubble. A heavy wool blanket was draped meticulously over his legs. He didn't turn around. "I explicitly said I wanted the agency's senior representative," Desmond said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the quiet room. "You breathe too loud, and your shoes squeak. It's the rubber soles." "OSHA compliance," Sadie said, dropping her tote bag onto a leather armchair. It landed with a heavy, ungraceful thud. Desmond finally turned the chair. The motor whined softly. His face was striking but hard. Deep lines bracketed his mouth. His eyes, a pale, icy blue, swept over her with brutal efficiency. He registered the coffee stain. He registered the messy bun. He registered the fact that she was trembling slightly, though whether from fear or a caffeine crash he couldn't tell. "You're not a senior nurse," he stated. "I have my LPN, and I have references. Well, one reference. But she really likes me." Sadie crossed her arms. "Look, Mr. Gallagher, you fired the last 4 nurses the agency sent. Word is you're impossible to work for. You throw things. You refuse physical therapy. You insulted a woman so badly she cried in the driveway. She treated me like a toddler." Desmond said, his tone devoid of apology. "She spoke to me in a pitch usually reserved for golden retrievers. I don't need a mother." "Good, because I barely kept a succulent alive last week," Sadie shot back. Desmond's eyes narrowed. He rolled his chair forward. The movement was smooth, but Sadie noticed the white-knuckle grip he had on the joystick, the tension in his forearms. He hated the machine. He hated relying on it. It radiated off him in waves of suffocating anger. "Why are you here?" he asked softly, the kind of soft that preceded violence. "I need the money," Sadie said. Honesty was the only card she had left. "You pay triple the going rate. I have rent due a car that just died at your gate, and I don't care if you're an irritable bastard. I can lift you, I can catheterize you, I can monitor your vitals, and I won't use a baby voice. In exchange, you sign my paycheck." Desmond stared at her. The silence stretched. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a sledgehammer. He reached over to a side table, picking up a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid. His hand trembled slightly, a residual nerve issue from the explosion that took his legs. The glass slipped. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp fragments. Whiskey splashed across the polished oak. Sadie didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She looked at the mess, then looked at him. "You missed the rug," she noted. Desmond's jaw tightened. "Clean it up." It was a test. A blatant, degrading power play. Sadie looked at the shards. She looked at the mob boss, sitting in a machine he despised. She walked over her rubber soles, squeaking deliberately. She bypassed the broken glass, entirely stepped right over it, and stopped in front of his chair. She leaned down. She grabbed the heavy wool blanket covering his legs and yanked it off. Desmond reacted on instinct. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with crushing force. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snarled. Sadie didn't struggle. She just looked down at his legs. They were thin. Muscle atrophy had already set in over the last 6 months. They were limbs, but they were useless to him. "You're hiding under a blanket in a 70-degree room," Sadie said quietly. "If I'm working for you, I need to see what I'm working with. You have pressure sores starting on your left calf. Your circulation is poor. And if you squeeze my wrist any harder, I won't be able to push your chair." He let go. He looked at her with a mixture of shock and sheer rage. No one touched him. No one addressed the reality of his body so bluntly. His men looked away. His previous nurses had hovered, patting the blanket, trying to pretend he wasn't half dead. "You're hired," Desmond said flatly. "Frankie will show you your room. Clean up the glass before you go." "I'm a nurse, Mr. Gallagher, not a maid," Sadie said. She turned and walked toward the door. "Tell Frankie to bring a broom." She shut the heavy doors behind her. In the hallway she leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and exhaled a shaky breath. She had the job. Now she just had to survive it. 2 weeks later, the reality of the job set in. It wasn't just checking vitals or administering nerve blockers. It was the crushing daily grind of managing a human body that refused to cooperate with its owner's commands. It was 3 a.m. The compound was dead quiet. Sadie sat in the corner of Desmond's expansive bedroom, reading a paperback by the light of a small desk lamp. The rain lashed against the bulletproof glass windows. A sharp, sudden intake of breath from the bed broke the silence. Sadie dropped the book. She was by the bed in 3 seconds. Desmond was awake. His chest heaved. His hands gripped the silk sheets so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His jaw was locked in agony. "Spasm?" Sadie asked. Her voice was low, entirely professional. He managed a stiff nod. The nerve damage from the severed spinal cord didn't just cause paralysis. It caused phantom pains, violent muscle spasms that twisted his dead legs into knots he couldn't feel, but somehow still agonizingly experienced in his brain. Sadie threw the covers back. His right leg was jumping, the muscles contracting violently against the bone. "Okay, I've got you," she said. She didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the edge of the mattress. She placed her hands firmly over his thigh and calf, applying heavy downward pressure. She leaned her entire body weight into it, fighting the violent jerking of his leg. Desmond squeezed his eyes shut, his head rolling back against the pillows. A harsh, guttural groan tore from his throat. He hated this. He hated being seen like this, weak, writhing, completely at the mercy of a girl who barely weighed 120 pounds. "Breathe, Desmond," Sadie instructed. It was the first time she hadn't called him Mr. Gallagher. "It won't." "Stop," he gritted out through clenched teeth. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "It will. Give it a minute." She adjusted her grip. The physical exertion was immense. His leg was heavy, dead weight, animated by chaotic electrical signals. "Talk to me. Distract yourself. Tell me why there are 3 locked rooms on the 2nd floor." "None of your business," he rasped. "Fine, keep focusing on the pain then. Great strategy." A harsh breath punched out of him. "Guns, cash, archives." Archives. Fancy word for blackmail. Something like that. The spasm began to peak. The leg jerked violently, throwing Sadie off balance. She slipped her elbow, catching him hard in the ribs. "Shit, sorry," she hissed, scrambling to reset her grip and pin the leg down again. Desmond let out a breathless, broken laugh. It sounded more like a cough. "You're a terrible nurse. I warned you," she said, bearing down on his shin. "You hired me anyway. You get what you pay for." Slowly, agonizingly, the violent jerking subsided. The muscles unclenched. The leg went limp again. Dead flesh. Sadie didn't move away immediately. She stayed kneeling on the bed, her hands resting on his shin, feeling the chaotic pulse of his nerves settle. The only sound in the room was their ragged breathing and the rain hitting the glass. Desmond opened his eyes. He looked at her. She was wearing an oversized faded band t-shirt and flannel pajama pants. Her hair was a tangled mess. She wasn't looking at him with pity. She was just waiting to see if the spasm would return. "You can get off my bed now," he said quietly. Sadie released his leg and slid off the mattress. She pulled the covers back up, smoothing them out. "You need to up the dosage on the baclofen. The spasms are getting more frequent." "No, the pills make my head cloudy. I can't run a business with a cloudy head." "You can't run a business if you haven't slept in 3 days because your legs are doing the Macarena all night," Sadie countered, walking over to the sink in the corner to wash her hands. "Do not mock my condition, Sadie. I'm mocking your stubbornness. Your condition is just collateral damage." She dried her hands on a towel and turned to face him. "Take the pill, Desmond. I'm not going to sit here and watch you suffer for the sake of your ego." He stared at the ceiling. The sheer exhaustion on his face was profound. The mafia boss, the ruthless killer, the man who ordered hits with a flick of his wrist. He was just a tired man, trapped in a broken body. "1 pill," he muttered. Sadie smiled softly. A genuine, quiet smile. She prepped the medication, handed him the small paper cup and a glass of water. He took it without complaint. "Get some sleep," she said, turning off the bedside lamp. "Sadie," his voice stopped her before she reached her chair. She turned in the gloom. "Yeah, thank you." It was a barely audible whisper. A concession dragged out of him. "Don't get sentimental on me, Gallagher," she replied dryly, sinking into a chair. "It's in my contract." But as she pulled the blanket up to her chin, she knew the lines were already blurring. He wasn't just a paycheck anymore, and she wasn't just his employee. The syndicate didn't pause for paraplegia. Sadie learned this the hard way on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in the kitchen aggressively trying to scrape burnt eggs off a non-stick pan when Frankie walked in. He looked stressed. "Boss needs you in the study," Frankie said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's not time for his meds. And he's in a meeting," Sadie said, scrubbing harder. "Yeah, well, the meeting ain't going good. He buzzed me, said to bring you in." Sadie frowned, dropping the sponge. She dried her hands and followed Frankie down the cavernous hallways. The atmosphere in the house had been thick with tension since morning. Black SUVs had rolled through the gates, discharging men in dark suits with hard faces. Frankie pushed open the heavy double doors to the study. The room was thick with cigar smoke. Desmond was behind his desk. Across from him sat 3 men. Sadie recognized one of them from the dossiers Desmond sometimes left carelessly on his nightstand. Wyatt, a high-ranking lieutenant in the organization. Wyatt was a broad, bull-necked man with a scar slicing through his left eyebrow. He looked angry. Desmond looked completely unbothered, leaning back in his wheelchair, steepling his fingers. But Sadie knew his tells. She saw the tight cord of muscle in his neck. She saw the rigid posture. The men stopped talking the second she walked in. Wyatt turned his eyes, raking over her scrubs. "This a joke, Desmond?" Wyatt asked, a sneer curling his lip. "We're discussing the port shipments and you call in the nursemaid." Desmond ignored Wyatt. He looked directly at Sadie. "Sadie, my legs are aching. I need my stretchers." Sadie blinked. Stretchers. Now he hated physical therapy. He avoided it like the plague. She caught the minute, intense flare in his eyes. A silent command. "Play along." "Right. Sorry I'm late. The kitchen sink backed up." Sadie lied smoothly, walking around the large mahogany desk. She felt the hostile eyes of the 3 men tracking her every move. This was a dominance display, but she wasn't sure who was playing who. "We're not done here, Desmond," Wyatt growled, leaning forward, placing his heavy hands flat on the desk. "The word on the street is that you're weak. The Italians are encroaching on the south side. They think because you're confined to that chair you can't push back." Desmond didn't flinch. "The street talks too much, Wyatt. I run this family from the neck up. My legs have nothing to do with it. With all due respect," another man muttered, "respect requires a show of strength. You haven't left this house in 6 months." Sadie knelt beside Desmond's chair. She unlatched the footrests. The heavy silence in the room pressed down on her. She took Desmond's right leg, dead heavy weight, and lifted it. "You're doubting my capability to lead," Desmond said smoothly, his voice devoid of anger, which made it 10 times more terrifying. "We're saying the men need a leader who can stand with them." Wyatt pushed, clearly emboldened. "Maybe it's time you stepped back. Let someone else handle the day-to-day." Sadie felt Desmond's thigh muscle twitch, not a nerve spasm, but a violent, suppressed urge to lunge. He couldn't. He was anchored to the machine. The sheer humiliation of the moment hung in the air. Wyatt was staging a soft coup, banking on Desmond's physical vulnerability. Sadie didn't think, she just acted. She stood up abruptly, dropping Desmond's leg. It hit the footrest with a dull thud. She turned to Wyatt, wiping her hands on her scrubs. "Excuse me," Sadie said, her voice piercing the heavy masculine tension. "Are you a doctor?" Wyatt blinked, entirely thrown off guard by the chaotic girl in the stain-covered scrubs addressing him. "What? Are you a neurologist, an orthopedic surgeon?" Sadie stepped around the desk, invading Wyatt's personal space. She was a foot shorter than him, but she carried the absolute unhinged confidence of a woman who regularly negotiated with utility companies to keep her lights on. "Because if you're not, I suggest you shut your mouth about Mr. Gallagher's physical condition. Listen here, little girl." Wyatt started his face, flushing dark red. "No, you listen." Sadie snapped her finger, jabbing the air an inch from his chest. He survived 2 pounds of C4 under his chassis. His spinal cord was severed. By all medical logic, the trauma should have killed him, or at least left him a vegetable. Instead, he was awake and dictating orders to his lawyer from the ICU 4 days later. The man's pain threshold is higher than your IQ, and he operates on 4 hours of sleep and nerve blockers. The room was dead silent. Frankie, standing by the door, let out a very quiet, smothered cough. Desmond watched her utterly motionless. Sadie didn't stop. She was running on pure defensive adrenaline. "He doesn't need to stand up to run you. He could run this entire operation from an iron lung. Now you can either sit down, shut up, and talk about the port shipments, or you can leave so I can finish his medical care." Because, frankly, you're raising his blood pressure, and I do not have the patience to deal with a stroke today." She glared at Wyatt. Wyatt glared back, his jaw working. He looked from Sadie to Desmond. Desmond finally smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You heard the nurse, Wyatt," Desmond said softly. "My blood pressure. Sit down." The tension broke. It didn't dissipate, but it shifted. Wyatt slowly sank back into his leather chair. The other two men exchanged uneasy glances. Sadie turned her back on them, an incredibly dangerous thing to do in a room full of mobsters, and knelt back down beside Desmond's chair. Her hands were shaking violently now. She hid them by gripping his calf, pretending to massage the cold muscle. Desmond looked down at her. The anger was gone from his eyes, replaced by something entirely different. Something heavy. Something assessing. He rested his hand on the arm of his chair, letting his fingers brush lightly against the crown of her head, in a fleeting, almost imperceptible gesture of approval. "The south side is mine." Desmond addressed the room, his tone authoritative, the momentary weakness utterly erased. "If the Italians want a war, they can have it. But we don't bleed onto the streets. We choke their supply lines. Wyatt, you're going to the docks tonight." As the men fell back into line, taking orders from the man in the chair, Sadie kept her head down, focusing on the slow, rhythmic stretching of his leg. She had just inserted herself into the volatile politics of a criminal syndicate. She had made herself a target. But as Desmond's hand shifted, resting lightly on her shoulder, anchoring her to him in the room full of wolves, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want to be anywhere else. The adrenaline crush hit Desmond exactly 3 hours after the capos left the estate. Sadie heard it before she saw it. A low, muffled curse from the master bathroom, followed by the heavy, sickening thud of dead weight hitting expensive tile. She dropped the inventory clipboard and sprinted down the hall. Desmond was on the floor. He had tried to execute a solo transfer from his wheelchair to the shower bench. It was a maneuver he usually managed with brutal upper body strength and sheer stubbornness. But the stress of the afternoon meeting had drained his reserves. His arms had given out. He lay half-propped against the cold porcelain of the bathtub, his legs tangled uselessly beneath him at an unnatural angle. The water was running, filling the room with thick, suffocating steam. Sadie didn't gasp. She didn't ask if he was okay. It was a stupid question, and Desmond despised stupid questions. She turned off the water first, cutting through the roar of the showerhead. Then she knelt beside him. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling in jagged rhythms. His eyes were squeezed shut, his jaw clamped tight enough to crack molars. The humiliation radiating off him was almost radioactive. "Left leg is pinned," Sadie said, her voice clinically flat. "I'm going to straighten it. Tell me if the hip catches." "Don't," Desmond ground out. He opened his eyes. They were completely devoid of the cold authority he had wielded in the study. They were just exhausted. "Get Frankie." "Frankie is outside dealing with the perimeter guards," Sadie replied, wedging her hands under his knee. "Besides, Frankie has the delicate touch of a freight train. You want a dislocated hip, call Frankie." She didn't wait for his permission. She braced her weight and pulled. His leg, heavy and uncooperative, slid out from under him. He hissed through his teeth as the dormant muscles were forced to straighten. "Okay, you're clear." Sadie sat back on her heels, swiping a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm going to hook my arms under yours. On 3, we pivot to the bench. You use the grab bar. I take the lower body weight. Understand?" Desmond stared at the tiled wall. The muscles in his neck were rigid. To be hauled up off the floor by a woman half his size was a specific kind of hell for a man who ruled a city through fear. Maintain dignity. The patient will often redirect anger regarding their loss of autonomy toward the caregiver. Do not internalize it. Address the physical need. Basic Guidelines for Paraplegic Care. Page 42. Sadie had read the manual on the bus ride to the interview. The manual was bullshit. There was no dignity here, only survival. Desmond. Look at me, she demanded quietly. He didn't move. Look at me. Slowly his gaze shifted to hers. I am not your capos, Sadie said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. I don't want your territory. I don't care about your pride. I only care about getting you off this freezing floor before your core temperature drops and triggers another spasm. Now grab the bar. He held her stare for a long, heavy second. Then he reached up. His massive hand clamped around the steel grab bar, bolted to the wall. 1. Sadie counted, sliding her arms under his armpits, locking her hands behind his back. The heat of his skin burned through his thin undershirt. 2. She planted her rubber-soled boots squarely on the wet tile. 3. Desmond pulled with a massive surge of strength, his biceps straining veins pressing against his skin. Sadie hoisted backward, lifting his center of gravity, dragging his dead legs up from the floor. They moved as one clumsy, desperate unit, pivoting through the heavy air until he was safely deposited onto the padded shower bench. Sadie slumped against the opposite wall, gasping for breath. Her scrubs were soaked with sweat and steam. Desmond sat on the bench, leaning forward, resting his forehead against his fist. The silence in the bathroom was absolute. Why did you do it? He asked. His voice was raw. Do what? In the study. Desmond lifted his head. You mouthed off to a man who has killed people for spilling his drink. You painted a target on your back. Why? Sadie picked up a discarded towel and began wiping down the wet tile where he had fallen. She wouldn't look at him. He was pissing me off. I have a low tolerance for arrogant meatheads. Don't lie to me, Sadie. She stopped wiping. She stared at the towel in her hands. The truth was messy. The truth was that when Wyatt had looked at Desmond with pity, a violently protective rage had clawed its way up her throat. Because you were trapped, she finally said, her voice tight. You couldn't stand up and punch him in the teeth. If you had tried and failed, they would have smelled blood in the water. So I did it for you. You can't fire me for it. I already cleaned the floor. Desmond didn't smile. He looked at her with a heavy, searching intensity. The lines of his face softened just a fraction, dropping the mask of the ruthless boss. You're a liability, Sadie, he murmured. I'm an asset, she corrected, standing up and tossing the towel into a hamper. I'm the only one in this house who isn't afraid of you. Now take your shower. I'll be right outside the door if you decide to go tumbling again. She walked out, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her. Desmond sat alone in the steam. He looked at his motionless legs. Then he looked at the closed door. For the first time in 6 months, the silence in the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like someone was finally breathing life back into it. The mandate came down 3 days later. A sit-down with the rival faction. Neutral ground. A downtown restaurant that Desmond nominally owned. Sadie stood in the foyer, her arms crossed, watching Frankie load a small armory into the trunk of a black SUV. Desmond sat by the front door, wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. The wool blanket was draped neatly over his lap. He looked like royalty, cold, untouchable royalty. I'm coming, Sadie announced. Desmond didn't even look up from his phone. No, you're not. This is business. Your business involves high-stress potential violence, and you haven't taken your muscle relaxers today because you need a clear head. Sadie fired back, walking over to his chair. If you trigger autonomic dysreflexia during the appetizer course, your blood pressure will spike to stroke levels in 3 minutes. Do Wyatt and Frankie know how to administer the emergency nitro spray? Do they even know where it is? Frankie paused, slamming the trunk shut. He looked at Desmond. She's got a point, boss. I ain't no doctor. Desmond glared at Frankie, who wisely looked down at the pavement. "I stay in the car." Sadie compromised, softening her tone. "I sit in the back of the SUV with my medical kit. You go in, you intimidate whoever needs intimidating, and I'm there if your nervous system decides to declare war on your brain." Desmond looked at her. She was wearing her usual chaotic ensemble faded jeans, a band t-shirt, and a heavy canvas jacket. She looked completely out of place in his dark, violent world. But her chin was jutted out in that stubborn way he was quickly learning was immovable. "Fine," Desmond clipped. "You stay in the car. The doors remain locked. If you hear loud noises, you put your head between your knees and you don't look up." The drive downtown was tense. The city lights smeared against the tinted windows. Sadie sat in the back, the heavy leather medical bag resting on her lap. She watched the back of Desmond's head. He was radiating tension. The restaurant was located on a narrow street, flanked by tall brick buildings. Frankie pulled the SUV up to the curb. 2 escort cars parked ahead and behind them. 20 minutes, Desmond told Frankie. Frankie and another man helped transfer Desmond from the vehicle to his chair on the sidewalk. It was a smooth, practiced movement. Desmond adjusted his suit jacket, his face completely impassive. He rolled toward the restaurant doors, flanked by his men. Sadie sat in the quiet, idling SUV. The driver, a young kid named Paulie, kept his hands rigidly on the wheel eyes, darting to the rearview mirrors. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The first indication that things had gone to hell wasn't a gunshot. It was the sudden, violent shattering of the restaurant's front window. A body was thrown through the glass landing on the pavement in a shower of sharp, glittering shards. "Shit!" Paulie yelled, reaching inside his jacket. Then the gunfire started. It wasn't the clean, isolated pops from the movies. It was a deafening, chaotic roar that echoed off the brick buildings, vibrating deep in Sadie's chest. Rule 1 of an active shooter situation: stay down. Rule 2: assess injuries. Rule 3: do not become a second victim. Sadie ignored all 3. She threw open the door of the SUV and scrambled out onto the pavement. "Desmond!" She screamed, the sound swallowed by the gunfire. "Get back in the car, crazy lady," Paulie roared, ducking behind the dashboard. Sadie dropped to a crouch, using the heavy metal body of the SUV as cover. She peered around the bumper. The street was chaos. Civilians were screaming, scrambling for cover. 2 of Desmond's men were returning fire from behind a parked sedan, aiming toward an alleyway across the street. Where was the chair? She spotted him. Desmond had been caught halfway between the restaurant door and the cars. He was pinned. His chair was angled awkwardly against a concrete planter, providing minimal cover. He had a gun in his hand, firing methodically toward the alley, but he was a sitting duck. He couldn't dive for cover. He couldn't run. He was anchored to the machine. A bullet ricocheted off the concrete planter, showering Desmond with grey dust. Sadie didn't think. The pragmatic, cynical nurse who demanded hazard pay evaporated, leaving behind a woman driven by pure, unadulterated panic for the man in the chair. She ran. She broke cover, sprinting across the 15 feet of open sidewalk. The air cracked and whined around her. Desmond saw her coming. His eyes went wide with absolute terror. "Sadie, get down!" He bellowed, his voice tearing over the gunfire. She hit the ground next to his chair, sliding on the rough pavement, scraping her knees bloody through her jeans. She jammed herself into the narrow space between the concrete planter and the heavy wheels of his chair. "Are you insane?" Desmond roared, grabbing her collar and yanking her down further. He practically threw himself over her, using his broad torso to shield her small frame, completely exposing his own back. "I'm your nurse," Sadie yelled back, her hands shaking so badly she could barely clench them. "My patient is under fire." "I don't need a pulse check, I need covering fire," he shouted, firing twice more over the planter. "I don't have a gun, I have a stethoscope." A bullet slammed into the armrest of Desmond's chair, missing his elbow by an inch. The heavy metal casing shattered, sending shrapnel biting into his shoulder. He grunted, dropping his arm, his gun clattering to the sidewalk. Desmond, Sadie panicked, seeing the dark bloom of blood on his charcoal suit. "I'm fine. I'm fine," he hissed, though his face was pale. The gunfire was beginning to taper off. Sirens wailed in the distance. The rival crew was falling back their ambush, broken by Frankie's aggressive, flanking maneuver from the alley. Frankie sprinted over his face, smeared with grease and blood. "Boss, we gotta move. Cops are 2 minutes out." "Get her in the car," Desmond ordered, pointing a trembling finger at Sadie. "Get you in the car," Sadie snapped, already reaching for the joystick of his chair to maneuver it out of the tight spot. "Your shoulder is bleeding. You're going into shock." "Leave the chair," Desmond commanded Frankie. "It's too slow. Carry me." Frankie didn't hesitate. He slung his weapon, leaned down, and hauled Desmond out of the chair in a fireman's carry. The complete loss of dignity, the absolute vulnerability of being slung over another man's shoulder like a sack of flour, was evident in the tight white line of Desmond's mouth. Sadie grabbed the heavy medical bag from the pavement and ran behind them, diving into the back of the SUV just as the tires squealed. They tore away from the curb, leaving the custom $40,000 wheelchair abandoned on the bloody sidewalk. The safe house was a windowless, concrete-reinforced basement beneath an auto repair shop on the east side. It smelled of motor oil, damp earth, and now copper. Desmond sat on a battered leather sofa in the center of the room. His jacket was gone. His shirt was unbuttoned, pulled down to expose his left shoulder. A jagged piece of metal from the wheelchair's armrest had sliced a deep, ugly gash across his deltoid. Sadie stood in front of him, hands encased in blue latex gloves. A harsh, overhead fluorescent light cast deep shadows beneath her eyes. She worked in absolute silence. She flushed the wound with saline, the liquid running pink down his heavily tattooed bicep. Desmond didn't flinch. He sat rigid, staring straight ahead at the concrete wall. "I need to stitch it," Sadie said. Her voice was steady, professional, completely detached from the woman who had sprinted through an active firefight 20 minutes ago. "I have local anesthetic. It'll sting. Just do it," he rasped. She prepped the needle, injected the lidocaine around the torn flesh, and waited a minute for it to take effect. The silence in the room was suffocating. Frankie and the others were upstairs standing guard, making calls, trying to figure out who had leaked the location of the sit-down. Sadie threaded the suture needle. She leaned in close, invading his personal space, her focus entirely on the wound. "You're shaking," Desmond observed. His voice was a low, rough rumble in his chest. "Adrenaline crash," Sadie replied, not looking at his face. "It's physiological. I can't control it. You could have died. So could you." "I am a target, Sadie. It's the life I chose." Desmond turned his head, forcing her to look at him. His pale blue eyes were burning with a fierce, suppressed anger. "You are a civilian. You ran into crossfire to protect a man who can't even stand up to protect you back. It was the single most idiotic thing I have ever witnessed." Sadie paused, the needle hovering over his skin. She looked at him. Really looked at him. The mob boss facade was entirely stripped away. He wasn't angry because she had disobeyed orders. He was angry because he had felt helpless. He hated that he had needed a woman with a stethoscope to risk her life because his body had failed him. "I didn't run out there to protect a mob boss," Sadie said quietly. She pushed the needle through the numbed skin, pulling the black thread tight. "I ran out there because I wasn't going to sit in a car and watch you get shot. You shouldn't care," he stated. "It wasn't a command. It was a desperate plea for logic in a situation that had none. I pay you to manage my body, not my life." Well, the lines got blurred, Desmond. She tied off the first stitch and snipped the thread. "You can dock my pay," He let out a harsh, bitter breath. I abandon my chair. I get carried away like a helpless child while my men fight, and you throw yourself over me. He shook his head, a gesture of profound self-disgust. You deserve better than working for a cripple who can't even offer you cover. Sadie froze. The self-pity in his voice was a sharp, jagged thing. It was the first time she had heard him use the word cripple to describe himself. She dropped the scissors onto the metal tray with a loud clatter. She ripped off her latex gloves, throwing them onto the floor. Don't do that, she snapped her voice, rising, echoing off the concrete walls. Desmond looked startled by her sudden anger. Do what? Throw a pity party. Sadie planted her hands on her hips, her eyes blazing. You think I care about the chair? You think anyone who actually matters cares about the damn chair you threw your body over mine out there? You shielded me. You took a piece of shrapnel meant for my face. You are the most fiercely protective, stubborn, terrifyingly capable man I have ever met. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she was standing between his knees. Your legs are dead, Desmond. Not your spine. Not your heart. Stop acting like the explosion took your manhood, because it didn't. The air in the basement thickened. The harsh hum of the fluorescent light seemed to fade. Desmond stared at her. Her chest was heaving. Her hair was wild, her cheek smeared with a streak of dirt and something that looked suspiciously like his own blood. She was chaotic, completely disrespectful, and entirely magnificent. Slowly, deliberately, Desmond reached out with his uninjured arm. He wrapped his large hand around the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the messy hair at her nape. Sadie's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. You have no sense of self-preservation. He murmured, his thumb brushing a smudge of dirt from her jawline. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence that surrounded them. I preserve what matters, she whispered back. He pulled her down. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was heavy, desperate, and fueled by the raw adrenaline of surviving the night. Sadie leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his ruined shirt, grounding herself against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. For the first time since the bomb tore his life apart, Desmond didn't feel broken. He felt the soft, living heat of her mouth, the desperate grip of her hands, and the sudden, terrifying realization that he had something to lose again. When he finally broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, his breathing was ragged. I'm firing you, he whispered against her lips. Sadie let out a wet, breathless laugh. Good luck with that. I know where you hide your muscle relaxers. She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. The coldness was gone. The boss was gone. There was just Desmond. Finish the stitches, he ordered softly. Sadie picked up a fresh pair of gloves. Yes, boss. The replacement wheelchair arrived 3 days after the ambush. It was an upgraded model, matte black, reinforced titanium frame, all-terrain tires. A piece of tactical hardware, not medical equipment. Sadie hated it immediately. It looked heavy. It looked like a cage. She stood in the center of the massive, sunlit living room, watching 2 technicians from the medical supply company unbox it. Desmond sat on the leather sofa, his left arm in a sling from the shrapnel wound. He was entirely silent. He hadn't looked at her directly since the basement. The kiss had changed the atmosphere in the house from tense to suffocating. Desmond had rebuilt his walls overnight, pouring concrete over the cracks she had managed to hammer through. He was brusque. He refused his pain medication again. He demanded double shifts from his perimeter guards. All set, Mr. Gallagher, the head technician said, stepping back from the chair. Joystick calibration is tighter on this model. Battery life is extended. Leave, Desmond ordered. The technicians scrambled out, escorted by a heavily armed man named Miller. Sadie walked over to the chair. She kicked the front caster tire with the toe of her boot. It's ugly. The other one had better lumbar support. "It's not a luxury sedan, Sadie. It's functional," Desmond said sharply. He grabbed his cane, a heavy silver-topped piece of ash wood he used strictly for pivoting, and levered himself up from the sofa. It was a brutal, ugly process, with one good arm. Sadie instinctively stepped forward to brace him. "Don't!" he snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. She froze. Her hands dropped to her sides. Desmond locked his jaw, his bad shoulder trembling violently as he forced his entire upper body weight onto his right arm. He swung his dead hips over, hovering above the seat of the new chair. He misjudged the distance by an inch. He dropped hard onto the edge of the cushion, jarring his spine. A sharp gasp escaped his lips, his face turning an ashen grey. Sadie didn't help him adjust. She crossed her arms, her nails digging into her own skin. It took everything in her not to fix his legs, which were tangled awkwardly on the footrests. "Done punishing yourself?" she asked quietly. He finally looked at her. His blue eyes were absolute ice. "My organization is compromised. Someone sold my location to the Southside crew. Until I find the leak, this house is on lockdown. And that means you have to treat me like a hostile witness. It means you are a distraction I cannot afford." Desmond leaned back, finally breathing through the pain of the transfer. "You crossed a line in the alley. You crossed a line in the safe house. My men look to me for absolute, infallible leadership. They cannot see me compromised by a nurse." "Compromised?" Sadie let out a harsh laugh. "Because you kissed me. Because for 5 seconds you remembered you were a human being and not a machine. Because you are a weakness." The shout tore from his throat, echoing off the high ceilings. The silence that followed was deafening. Sadie stared at him. She saw the tight grip his right hand had on the armrest. She saw the fear he was desperately trying to bury under anger. He wasn't disgusted by her. He was terrified for her. In his world, whatever the boss loved, the enemy killed. "You think pushing me away is going to make me safer?" Sadie asked, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You think the people who shot up that restaurant are going to care about my job title? They saw me dive into the crossfire for you. I'm already on their radar, which is why you are leaving," Desmond said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. He tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud. "That is 6 months severance. Cash. Miller will drive you to the airport. You go to California. You do not come back." Sadie looked at the envelope. It was thick enough to solve every financial problem she had ever had. It was freedom. She walked over to the table. She picked it up. Desmond's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked wildly in his cheek. He watched her hold the money, waiting for the inevitable relief to wash over her face. He waited for her to run. Sadie gripped the envelope with both hands and tore it directly down the middle. The sound of thick paper ripping was obscenely loud. $100 bills fluttered to the Persian rug like dead leaves. "I don't run from bullies, Desmond," Sadie said, tossing the torn halves onto the floor. "And I don't abandon my patients. Your blood pressure is elevated. Your shoulder is bleeding through your shirt. I'll be in the kitchen making ice packs. Yell if you fall out of your ugly new chair." She turned her back on him and walked out of the room. Desmond sat entirely still amidst the scattered hundreds. He closed his eyes, dropping his head back against the headrest. A low, ragged exhale left his chest. It sounded dangerously like relief. The betrayal didn't come with a warning. It came at 2 a.m., accompanied by the silence of a severed security grid. Sadie was awake. She was sitting in the armchair in Desmond's bedroom, reading under the dim glow of a lamp. Desmond was asleep, breathing heavily, the pain medication she had finally bullied him into taking, knocking him out cold. The bedside monitor, which usually displayed the live feed from the perimeter cameras, flickered. The screen went entirely black. The soft hum of the central air conditioning died. The house plunged into profound, suffocating silence. Sadie dropped her book. She stood up, her pulse, instantly, hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She walked to the heavy bedroom door and pressed her ear against the wood. Footsteps, muffled, heavy and deliberate, moving down the hallway. It wasn't Frankie. Frankie dragged his left heel when he walked. These steps were military precise. Sadie bolted back to the bed. She clamped her hand over Desmond's mouth and shook his uninjured shoulder violently. His eyes snapped open. The instinct to thrash was immediate, but he registered her face in the gloom. She removed her hand, pressing a single finger to her lips. She pointed at the dead monitor. Desmond's eyes hardened. The drug-induced fog vanished, replaced by cold, tactical calculation. He didn't ask questions. Under the mattress. Right side. He whispered, his voice barely a rasp. Sadie dropped to her knees. She shoved her hand between the heavy mattress and the box spring. Her fingers brushed cold, hard metal. She pulled out a matte black Glock 19. It was heavy, fully loaded. Safety is off. There's one in the chamber, Desmond murmured, hauling himself up into a sitting position, using his good arm. Help me to the chair. No, Sadie breathed. Chair is too exposed. You stay on the floor, behind the bed. She didn't give him a choice. She grabbed his legs, hauling them off the side of the bed, allowing gravity to drag his lower half down. Desmond grabbed the heavy oak bedpost, controlling his descent, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. His back pressed against the thick wood of the footboard. He was completely hidden from the doorway. Sadie pressed the gun into his right hand. "Hide!" he mouthed to her, pointing toward the walk-in closet. She shook her head stubbornly. She grabbed his heavy silver-topped cane from the nightstand and crouched on the opposite side of the bed. The bedroom door handle turned slowly. With a deafening crack, the door was kicked open. The heavy wood splintered against the frame. Two men stepped into the room. They wore tactical gear and night vision goggles pushed up on their foreheads. The moonlight from the window caught the silencers on their weapons. "Clear the bed," one whispered. They moved forward. Desmond didn't wait for them to realize the bed was empty. From his position on the floor, he fired twice. The loud, unsuppressed roars of the Glock were deafening in the enclosed space. The first man took a round to the knee. He screamed, his leg collapsing under him. As he went down, his weapon discharged wildly rounds, tearing through the mattress inches from Sadie's head. The second man pivoted, aiming down at the floor where the muzzle flash had originated. Sadie didn't think. She swung the heavy ashwood cane with the force of a baseball player aiming for the bleachers. The silver top connected directly with the second man's wrist. A sickening crunch echoed over the gunfire. The man dropped his weapon, letting out a howl of pain. Desmond fired again. The second man dropped a hole punched through his tactical vest. The first man, bleeding heavily on the floor, fumbled for his sidearm. Sadie brought the cane down on his temple. He went entirely limp. The room smelled of cordite burning feathers from the ruined mattress and copper. "Sadie!" Desmond's voice was strained, breathless. "Are you hit?" "No," she gasped, dropping the bloody cane. She crawled around the bed. "You—" "Fine." He was checking the magazine of the Glock, his face pale in the moonlight. That was a breach. Professional. Someone let them in. A slow, mocking clapping echoed from the hallway. "Excellent grouping, Desmond, even from the floor." The voice belonged to Wyatt. Wyatt stepped into the doorway. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He wore a sharp suit, a lit cigar clamped between his teeth. He held a high-powered revolver resting casually against his thigh. 3 more armed men stood behind him. "I assumed it was you, Wyatt," Desmond said. His voice was remarkably steady, devoid of panic. He didn't try to pull himself up. He sat on the floor among the blood and ruined bedding, owning the space like it was a throne. "You always were an impatient bastard." "Impatient?" Wyatt scoffed, stepping over the body of his hired gun. "I waited 6 months. I watched you govern this family from a hospital bed. I watched you hide behind locked doors. And now you're hiding behind the skirts of a nurse." Wyatt looked at Sadie, a filthy sneer crossing his face. "You should have taken the cash, sweetheart. I saw him give you the envelope on the cameras. Cameras are a violation of privacy." Sadie snapped back, though her hands were shaking. She pressed her shoulder against Desmond's, grounding herself against his solid warmth. "The family needs strength, Desmond." Wyatt addressed his boss. "You can't even stand up to look your executioner in the eye." "I don't need to stand to kill you, Wyatt," Desmond said softly. "You're out of rounds," Wyatt noted, nodding at the Glock in Desmond's hand. "You fired 4. That clip holds 10. I know you rarely reload your own weapons these days. Clumsy fingers?" He raised the revolver, pointing it squarely at Desmond's chest. "Last words, boss." Desmond didn't look at the gun. He looked at Sadie. A silent, terrifying communication passed between them. The chair. Wyatt had stepped too far into the room. He was standing directly in front of the heavy matte black motorized wheelchair Sadie had despised all day. Desmond's left hand, the one hidden behind his back, wasn't idle. It was wrapped around his smartphone. The smart home integration the technicians had bragged about that afternoon. Desmond hit a button on the screen. The 400-pound titanium wheelchair surged forward with the acceleration of a small tank. It didn't just bump Wyatt. It slammed into the back of his knees with brutal motorized force. Wyatt shrieked as his legs folded in the wrong direction. The heavy metal footrests crushed his shins against the floorboards. The revolver flew from his hand, clattering beneath the bed. Before Wyatt's men in the hallway could process what had happened, a deafening roar of automatic gunfire erupted from the corridor. Frankie and 3 loyal guards flooded the hallway, tearing through the traitors. The gunfire was brief, deafening, and final. Wyatt lay on the floor, pinned beneath the massive weight of the wheelchair, weeping openly, clutching his shattered legs. Desmond sat on the floor completely unharmed. He dropped the empty Glock. He looked at Wyatt, who was writhing in the exact position Desmond found himself in every single day. Paralyzed. Broken. Strength isn't in your legs, Wyatt. Desmond said, his voice cold, devoid of mercy. It's in your mind, and yours was always incredibly weak. Frankie stepped into the room, his face splattered with blood. He looked at the bodies, looked at Wyatt, pinned by the chair, and finally looked at his boss sitting on the floor. "House is secure, boss," Frankie breathed heavily. "We got the rest of them at the gates." "Get him out of my house," Desmond ordered, pointing a trembling finger at Wyatt. "Take him to the warehouse. Call the doctor to set his legs. I want him awake when I deal with him tomorrow." Frankie nodded, hauling a sobbing Wyatt out from under the wheelchair by his collar, dragging him out of the room. The silence rushed back in. The dawn broke grey and heavy, washing the shattered bedroom in a pale light. The bodies were gone. The blood had been scrubbed from the hardwood, leaving behind the sharp scent of bleach to mask the copper. Sadie sat on the edge of the mattress. Her scrubs were ruined. She had a bruise forming on her cheekbone and a small cut above her eyebrow from flying wood splinters. Desmond was back in his chair. Frankie had helped lift him. He sat by the window looking out at the sprawling estate. The empire was his again. The rot had been cut out. "You stayed," Desmond said to the glass. "I told you I don't run." Sadie rubbed her temples. The adrenaline crash this time was monumental. She felt hollowed out, entirely exhausted. Desmond turned the chair. He wheeled toward her. He didn't stop until his knees were brushing hers. He looked at the bruise on her face, his jaw tightening. "I meant what I said," he murmured, his voice rough. "You are a liability. You make me care whether you live or die. In this business, that is a death sentence." "Then quit the business," Sadie said simply. Desmond let out a short, hollow laugh. "It's not a corporation, Sadie. You don't just resign. The wolves are always at the door. You're a smart man. You run the ports, you run the real estate. Transition to legitimate fronts. You don't need to be dealing in blood anymore. You just wiped out the last crew that opposed you. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, looking up at him. You don't have to be the ruthless monster just to prove you aren't weak. He stared down at her. He saw the sheer, unyielding stubbornness in her eyes. She had seen him at his absolute worst, crawling on the floor, dragged like dead weight, bleeding and vulnerable. And she was still here. She wasn't looking at the chair. She was looking at him. Desmond reached out. His large, rough hand cupped her cheek, his thumb gently brushing just beneath the cut on her brow. You shouldn't have thrown the envelope away, he whispered. It was cash. I prefer direct deposit, she replied, leaning her face into his palm. I can't offer you a normal life. Normal is boring. Normal didn't involve me bludgeoning a man with a cane tonight. I think I found my calling. Desmond smiled. It wasn't the cold, sharp smile of the mob boss. It was genuine, reaching his eyes, breaking through the harsh lines of his face. It made him look younger. It made him look alive. He leaned down, closing the distance between them. He kissed her. It was slow, deliberate, and entirely stripped of desperation. It was a promise. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers. No more hourly wages, Desmond stated quietly. Are you offering me a salary? Sadie teased her hands, coming up to rest on his broad shoulders. I'm offering you the empire, he corrected. Equal partnership. I run the city, and I run you, Sadie finished for him. God help me. Desmond groaned softly, kissing her again. Yes, they stayed like that, as the sun fully crested the horizon, casting warm, golden light across the room. The wheelchair hummed softly beneath him, but it was no longer a cage. It was just a machine. He was the man in it. And for the first time in 6 months, he didn't feel paralyzed at all. He had his anchor. He had his queen, and anyone who thought they could break them would find out exactly how heavy dead weight could be. If this gritty, high-stakes romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Let us know in the comments below what your favorite moment between Desmond and Sadie was. Was it the brutal honesty or that epic safe house showdown? Don't forget to share this story with your fellow romance readers who love a fierce heroine and a morally grey, utterly devoted boss. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next dark, emotional audio drama. Stay chaotic, stay protective, and we'll see you in the next video.